Warzone and Modern Warfare 2 are great right now with so many different maps and modes on offer, so I'm going to cover the best updated graphics settings specifically for consoles, highlighting differences between old-gen consoles like Xbox One and PS4, and new-gen consoles like the PS5 and Xbox Series X and S. I know from previous videos on graphics that there has been mixed results depending on which generation you're on, so we're going to make sure your game looks great whichever console you're on today. And we start with on-demand texture streaming. This is essentially a setting which streams high-definition textures straight to your console. Now, the difficulty is with the difference in generations of consoles is the speed at which those textures are processed. So sometimes with the older generation consoles, it actually doesn't look great with this setting on. So if you are on the older generation consoles and you're finding some visual blurriness, then this is quite possibly one of the settings which you'll want to switch off. For newer generation consoles though, just keep it on, assuming you've got a decent connection. Then regardless of which platform you're on, you'll want world motion blur off, weapon motion blur off, film grain down to 0, and depth of field off as well. These minimize the visual noise, if you like, making things, including the enemy, much clearer. This is at the cost of the game looking a little more realistic or cinematic, but it will give us an upper hand and reduce some of the processing stress off our consoles. But just before we get into the rest of the settings, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Scry. Scry specifically make coolers for the PS5, and actually Scry's Arctic PlayStation 5 coolers are perfect for keeping your console running, whether you're in the middle of a heatwave or gaming all day long. They ensure you're still getting the best performance possible from your PS5, and that it will keep working for years to come. And since there are more and more reports of PS5s overheating, this really is a great time to pick up one of these Scry coolers. The Scry Arctic cooler is fantastic because it will cool your PS5 with its parallel lamella design, made for optimum heat dissipation, and it's also got 6 hyperfluid fans, which run at an incredible 10,000 RPM, and yet it's still super quiet. On top of that, it's really easy to install and there's no software required. It has a super speed USB port for transfer speeds up to 10 gigabytes per second. It can be used vertically or horizontally and supports both PS5 standard and disc versions. It really is as easy as taking it out of the box and inserting it into the back of your PS5. Then you just sit back and let the fans do their work, keeping your PS5 cool whatever the weather. Now, if you are interested in keeping your PS5 working at its best for years to come, then head over to scry.store and check out their Arctic PlayStation 5 coolers today. Now let's get back to the settings, and we're on to fidelityfx CAS. Now this can be a hugely important setting, but needs to be tweaked correctly depending on your personal preferences and which console you're on. So I'm on the Xbox Series X, which is obviously a newer gen console, and I personally find switching it on and turning the strength up to 100 works fantastically to reduce some of the blurriness that you can get on Warzone and make some of the textures pop that little bit more. Some people will find though that the sharpening that this has is a little too much for them, so newer gen console players may want to put it down to 50 or even lower if they want to. That's something you can try out in just one game. But if you are on the older generation consoles like the PS4, I do recommend actually switching this off. This setting on the older generation consoles, instead of making things look blurry, actually makes things look grainy in some instances. So you end up having a mix of blurry and grainy textures, which you really don't want. On top of that, having this setting on reduces your frames per second by a few as well, so you have to take that into consideration too. Then we have 120Hz refresh rate. This will only be available to next generation consoles, and we want this switched on assuming you've got a monitor or screen that can also handle 120Hz, as that enables us to have 120 frames per second. Then for field of view, this is a little bit of personal choice. I go all the way up to 120, but there are reports of aim assist actually reducing at these higher levels of FOV, so you may want to put it a little bit lower, but I wouldn't recommend going below 100. During Warzone 1, we were crying out for a field of view slider, so let's take advantage of it. Again though, you do have to take into consideration the higher your FOV, the lower your frames per second is going to be by a little bit. And of course, the higher it is, the smaller opponents will look in the distance, so they might be hard to spot. Then for ADS field of view, put that on affected. This ensures that when we aim in, we're still at the FOV value that we've just assigned here. Then for weapon field of view, put this on wide. It just makes the weapon slightly smaller so that you can see more on your screen. For camera movements, put these down to least, which is 50%. For brightness, I go all the way up to 75 these days, but anywhere between 60 and 80 I think is best. This ensures that you have good visibility on all maps, because obviously they do vary a little bit, with Ashika Island being a little darker and some rooms being a little darker on Al Mazrah, whereas Vondale is nice and light. For safe area, reduce these as much as possible possible. This just tucks your HUD into the center of the screen a little bit more, so your eyes don't have to track across to the minimap as far. Then we want to go over to interface and go down to color customization. This simple setting alone is quite a game changer and makes every single map look that little bit better. So we want the color filter on filtered 2, we want the target on both, and we want the intensity all the way up to 100. Other than that, the rest of these settings are very much personal preference. But now your game should look a lot better, clearer, and enemies should pop out a lot more. And now we're finished here, why don't you check out this video showcasing the best free skins we can get in Season 5, or you can head over here and make sure that you've got the best updated controller settings this Season too.